Welcome back to Weekly Bible Bits, the place where we take scripture, some faith, and a whole lot of real life, and we have an honest conversation about what it actually means to walk with God. Today I want to talk about something that I don't think is talked about enough in Christianity. Something that can completely transform you if you surrender to it. Now, of course, we've all heard of water baptism, right? It's a powerful declaration of faith in your walk with God. It's the moment when your old spiritual identity is buried and your new identity in Jesus emerges. But have you heard of the baptism by fire? Here's something important that I want you to remember. Water baptism doesn't mean you suddenly become perfect. I know a lot of us like to think we're perfect, and because we walk into a church every Sunday, that we're on our way to heaven. But the truth is, you don't come out of that water and instantly stop struggling. You don't suddenly lose every bad habit. You don't wake up the next morning and discover that temptation and sin doesn't exist anymore. You don't become flawless. You want to know what you do become? A little more aware or self-conscious. You become someone who decides that you don't want to live separated from God anymore. But here's the thing. The closer you get to God, the harder your life becomes. Because Christianity doesn't promise that you will never struggle. It's not for the faint of heart. It's the narrow road less traveled. John 16:33 says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So even God tells us that while we're here, we will have trouble. But the difference is, with Him, we're no longer facing it alone. And here's where I think many Christians get caught off guard. We think that once we've given our lives to God, life gets easier. The struggles just disappear. The pressures fade away. The confusion stops. And we think that our purpose should suddenly become obvious and everything should just start falling into place. But sometimes the opposite happens. You see, when you start taking your relationship with God seriously, you'll notice that life suddenly feels heavier. You start trying to change and suddenly temptation feels stronger. You start pursuing your purpose and suddenly resistance seems to come at you from every direction. You start trying to leave certain things behind and somehow those same things start calling your name louder than ever. And you start asking, God, what is happening? I mean, am I doing something wrong? Why does following you feel so difficult? I don't know, maybe you've been there, maybe you're there right now. And if you are, I want you to hear this. The fire isn't proof that God has abandoned you. The fire is just part of the process. I want you to think about gold for a second. Gold isn't refined in comfort, it's refined through heat. The fire doesn't create the gold, it just reveals what doesn't belong in it. And sometimes God allows us to walk through difficult seasons because there are things inside of us that comfort would never expose. Things like pride, fear, ego, control, distractions, dependence on other people, leaning on our own understanding. Things we thought we had surrendered, but didn't. You know, fire has a way of introducing you to your true self. And trust me, that's uncomfortable because we discover that the person we thought we were isn't actually the person we are. We discover how much of our faith depended on things going our way. We see that it's easier to say, God, I trust you, when the bills are paid, when the relationship is healthy, when the business is growing, when the opportunity comes through, when the prayer gets answered, when everything makes sense. But what happens when the prayer doesn't get answered? What happens when the opportunities disappear? What happens when the relationship ends? What happens when the dream takes longer than you expected? What happens when you're doing everything you can, but nothing changes and God feels silent? That is where faith gets tested. Not when everything is going right, but when you don't understand what God is doing. James 1 tells us that the testing of our faith produces perseverance. And that's a difficult scripture, trust me, because nobody's waking up saying, Lord, please give me some trials today so that I can build perseverance. We don't pray for the fire, but it comes anyway. And when it does, we have a choice. We can either assume that God has left us, or we can ask God, what are you developing in me through this? Because pressure reveals things. It reveals what we're really depending on, what we're really afraid of. It reveals where our identity actually lives and whether our faith is built on God or simply on the blessings that He gives us. And sometimes the thing you're asking God to remove is the very thing He's using to develop something in you. Whether that's patience, endurance, wisdom, humility, discipline, or compassion. And this applies to purpose too, especially purpose. Because we love talking about purpose when it sounds exciting. We love the dream. We love the vision. We love imagining the finished product. We love saying, I know I'm meant for greatness. I know I have a great purpose. But nobody likes talking about what that greatness and that purpose costs. Nobody likes talking about whether they're capable of carrying that purpose. Because purpose requires preparation. And preparation isn't always glamorous. Sometimes preparation looks like rejection, starting over, being overlooked, working in silence. Sometimes it looks like failing at something you genuinely believed would succeed, while watching other people move ahead, while you're still waiting, feeling stuck. And sometimes it looks like surviving a season you never would have chosen for yourself. You know, people will admire the strength you have later without knowing what it took to build it. They'll admire your wisdom without knowing how many mistakes it took to have that wisdom. They'll admire your peace without knowing how many sleepless nights you spent praying for it. They'll admire your faith without knowing how many times you almost gave up. Maybe you've been asking God, why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Maybe you've been feeling like you're under pressure from every direction. Maybe you're trying to grow, trying to become more disciplined, trying to walk in your purpose and get closer to God. But somehow, life just feels harder than it did before. If that's you, I want you to stop for a moment. Take a breath. Woosa. And don't automatically assume that the difficulty means that you're on the wrong path. Sometimes growth is uncomfortable. transformation hurts. And God is working in places inside of us that we didn't even know needed healing. But let me make something very clear. Not every hardship is automatically sent by God. Because we live in a broken world. People make choices. We make choices. Life happens and there are consequences. There's injustice and things that we simply cannot explain. So please don't romanticize suffering. Don't stay in an abusive situation because you think you have to endure the fire. Don't ignore wisdom because you think every painful circumstance is God's will. And don't stop seeking help when you need it. That said, when you're walking through the fire, you can still ask, Lord, what can you build in me through this? Because even when God didn't cause the fire, he can still meet you in it. He can still use it to strengthen you, and he can still teach you in it and bring something beautiful out of it. Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't avoid the furnace. They went into it. But they weren't alone. And sometimes the miracle isn't that God keeps you from entering the fire. Sometimes the miracle is discovering that he is with you in it. And remember, fire doesn't just test us, it transforms us. The person who walks out of the fire isn't always the person who walked into it. Okay? You may enter a season afraid and come out courageous. You may enter confused and come out wiser. You may enter dependent on everyone else's approval and come out secure in who God says you are. You may enter thinking you need everything to make sense and come out learning how to trust God, even when it doesn't. Maybe some things in you were never going to die in shallow water. Maybe some of those chains required the fire to burn them off. Maybe some lessons required pressure, and maybe some parts of your character could only be developed through the season that you're desperately trying to escape. I know that's not always comforting to hear when you're in the middle of it, because you don't always see what it's producing. You just feel the heat. But don't confuse the heat with God's absence. If you're in a difficult season right now, don't give up just because the process became uncomfortable. Don't run back to the habits that God is helping you leave behind, simply because the new life feels unfamiliar. Don't abandon your purpose because progress is slower than you expected. Don't assume that God has forgotten you because you can't see what he's doing. And don't measure God's presence by how comfortable your life feels. Because sometimes God is doing some of his deepest work in the seasons where you feel the least comfortable. So here's what I want you to sit with today. What if the season you're currently trying to escape is also teaching you something that you will need for the season that you're desperately praying for? And the very thing that you thought was breaking you is becoming the place where God builds you. You're not forgotten, you're not alone, and it's not the end. If this message spoke to you, don't just listen to it. Sit with it, pray about it, ask God what He's trying to develop in you in this season. And if you know someone who's walking through the fire right now, send this video to them. Because sometimes people don't need another answer. Sometimes they just need to be reminded that they're not walking through it alone. All right? So have a good one, guys. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep your faith, keep your eyes on God, and keep becoming who He created you to be. Take care.